Hey everybody, my name is Walt Lubbers. I'm the medical director for EMS at UK and one of the emergency medicine faculty. And hopefully you are a third year medical student who is on your EM rotation right now getting ready for our EMS workshop. So hopefully you'll find this somewhat interesting. If nothing else, it's not all that long. But this is probably the only time you're going to hear anything formally said about EMS in your medical school career or in your residency career. Now, if you go into emergency medicine, you might do a brief rotation on it or something like that. If you're really interested in it, you might even decide to go do what I did and do a fellowship, and then essentially do that as your career, at least as much as you feasibly can. But it's not for everybody, and I understand that, but you do have to know something about EMS in order to be a doctor, because EMS is the practice of medicine, and your hospital wants you to know about EMS. Even if you're a gynecologist or if you're a neurologist, your hospital is really interested in EMS bringing your gynecological or neurological patients to your hospital. And EMS is kind of the import business of medicine, and they help decide whether or not your hospital gets the $20,000 cath lab visit, or whether they get a bunch of drunken jerks every weekend. So it's important to know about EMS, and any kind of doctor may actually get tapped to kind of help with EMS, either as a medical director or as an advisor, or just to provide some education. So you got to kind of know a little bit about it. And like I said, even if you're not really interested in it, this won't take very long. So we'll start with a little bit of historical perspective. EMS is pretty young. Like emergency medicine is young as a specialty. EMS is even maybe a little bit younger. The idea of it is not all that young. We've heard about ambulances since the nearly prehistoric times, but as a formalized thing, it's relatively new. In the United States, if you trace EMS back, you kind of start in the 60s, and certainly there were mentions of it even during the Civil War, and most of this has been kind of fueled by military conflicts. But to get on the civilian side, back before the 60s, if you got in a car wreck and you were in the United States, the way that you got to the hospital was either you got back in your car and you drove yourself there, or you hoped that the police or the fire department would show up and would give you a ride there, or you tried to get a hold of a friend or a family member or somebody passing on the road, and hopefully somebody took you to the hospital. There wasn't really an ambulance that you could call that would come out and get you. There were rescue squads, but they did rescuing. They picked people up by the scruff of their neck and then got them out of the burning building, and that was about the end of it. So in the mid-'60s, in 1966, the National Academy of Science puts out this paper, which is the seminal white paper in EMS, called Accidental Death and Disability, the Neglected Disease of Modern Society. And you can still find this on the internet. It's not a hard read, and it gives you an interesting historical perspective. But what it basically says is that more people are dying as a result of car accidents than are dying as a result of getting shot or wounded in the military. And that's unacceptable. And so that spurred the development of the bill in 1966 called the Highway Safety Act. The Highway Safety Act created the Department of Transportation, and then the Department of Transportation created EMS and some other stuff, of course. So you'll hear references nowadays to like the Department of Transportation or the DOT curriculum in EMS, which was kind of the first standardized way of teaching EMTs and paramedics how to actually perform medical kind of stuff. That's followed up in 1973 by the EMS Systems Act. So everybody thinks it at this point is a good idea, and so an actual federal bill goes through that says everybody in the United States needs access to emergency medical services, and they make this block grant of $300 million available to the states. And so that's cool. It's nice to have money to fund this whole project. And it also lays out these components that every EMS system has to have and what everybody has essentially, again, a near right to in the U.S. And some of this stuff, when you look at today, you would kind of think, well, it's, that's kind of basic. The idea that an EMS provider should have some kind of medical training. Like, wow. But at the time, that was kind of revolutionary. Again, if you think of the rescue squads that were out there, they were firefighters and lay people and basically just the biggest, strongest guys in the city who you would get to come out and haul people around. The idea that you're going to put these people through a 6 or 8 week class and then send them out there and start having them do the stuff that doctors are doing was kind of revolutionary, and it wasn't all that fully accepted. This is also where you start getting things like the idea for trauma centers and stroke centers. The idea when we first start talking about you actually have to have a protocol to transfer somebody from hospital to hospital. You can't just put them in an ambulance and ship them over. This is where you get a lot of the modern emergency care that we still see today. Around this same time, you get these guys coming on the scene, and if you recognize them, cool, you'll be the first group in 3 years that knows who these guys are. The guy on the left is Roy DeSoto, and the guy on the right is Johnny Gage. And these are two guys that are characters, the main characters of a show called Emergency. And this was around in the 70s, and you can still see syndicated clips of it and sometimes full episodes out there now. It's kind of interesting. It was a soap opera, but the idea was these guys were the first paramedics, or groups of the first paramedics in LA County. At the time, there were only 12 paramedic programs in the United States. But you watch these guys go out, and they would go to the people's houses, and they would hook boxes up to people, and they'd give them drugs, and they'd start IVs, and they'd talk back to the hospital. And there was kind of the grouchy doctor at the hospital, and then there was kind of the cool doctor at the hospital, and the foxy nurse, and there was all kinds of interpersonal conflict and everything that made for a great TV show. But everybody saw that, and they thought, wow, I want Johnny and Roy to come and take care of me or my mom in the field. And so these guys are credited with doing as much to advance EMS in the 70s as almost anything else. And by the way, the guy on the right, his name is Randolph Mantooth, which is just an awesome name. So Johnny and Roy, and the show was Emergency. So everything was really cooking along, and everybody was kind of happy with EMS. The fervor kind of dies down in the 1980s. Pre-1981, if you follow the money, and it's not all about money, and I don't want to get into that too much, but there was this big block grant that was out there just for EMS stuff. After 1981, that money still existed, but it was given in a bigger kind of block to all the different states as just preventive health money. So not only was it now useful for EMS, but it could be used for soup kitchens or vaccines or healthcare for young mothers or something like that. What that kind of meant was that now while that money's out there, it might get diverted to other places. And since that time, EMS has been sort of a losing proposition for a lot of places. Some people have figured out how to make money at it, and not everybody agrees that that's something you should actually do. But EMS has been chronically underfunded since that time and still is today to a large extent. So that's kind of the history of EMS. We'll talk a little bit now about the different ways that EMS is provided and about the different providers that you may see out there. So there's 3 or maybe 4 basic types of EMS systems. We'll say that there's 3 for the sake of argument for you all. The one that you probably are most familiar with, at least here in Lexington or in a lot of larger cities, is a fire department-based model. And the idea here is that one day you may be fighting fires, you may be riding on the fire engine, and the next tour you may be riding on the ambulance. And so this is kind of good in some ways because that means that lots of folks out on fire trucks are also paramedic trained in a lot of cases, or at least EMTs. And they're sort of interchangeable. They're useful in both firefighting capacity and as an EMS capacity. And that's great. It's also got some downsides to it, too, in that fire tends to be more heavily funded and more heavily emphasized, and a lot of people that get into fire department-based services are there because they want to be firefighters. And a lot of folks, not everybody, but a lot of folks regard riding the ambulance as almost like a punishment because it's not really what they want to do. So that's fire department-based. And you'll find this in, again, like some bigger cities, and Lexington's a good example of it. Cincinnati's a good example of it. One of the other common ways that you find EMS provided to a municipality is as what's called a third service system. And that is there are 3 public safety services. There's the police, there's fire, and then EMS. And fire and EMS are separate in this case. So there may be folks that are firefighters and are paramedics, but they don't work for the same person at the same time, essentially, if you want to think of it that way. This is kind of nice for the EMS guys because it breaks you out from underneath fire command, and so you can focus on EMS and you can do more EMS-centric stuff. It's not all that great, though, because you still rely on the fire department for the most part. There are a lot more fire stations out there. There are a lot more fire providers out there often. And so you still may rely on them to be the first ones that are dispatched out so they can get to the scene quicker and start doing stuff like CPR and administering oxygen and that sort of stuff. There's other nuances and subtle things to it, but that's kind of the basics of it. And again, none of these are necessarily universally better. It sort of just depends on what your situation is. So that's third service EMS systems. Louisville is a great example of that. And then there's what's known as private EMS services. And you'll see these guys in Lexington, at least you'll see them driving around. It's the ones that are Rural Metro or AMR, American Medical Response. There's a big company in the South called Acadian. In Lexington, these guys do mostly transfers from, dialysis center to a nursing home or from hospital to hospital or stuff like that. But in a lot of places, companies like AMR actually provide the 911 response. There are some counties in eastern Kentucky not too far from us that rely on private services to do their actual 911 response. So it's not a government agency. The government pays a private company to provide that service. That's kind of good for the government agency because if you don't like the way things are done, you always hold the purse string, and so you can say, well, you didn't meet your response times or your care for this was lousy, get out. We'll find somebody else. And that's a big thing to be able to hold over a company. The sort of downside to it is that these are, again, private companies, and they have to be able to make money. That's why they're in business. They're not doing it because it's the right thing to do. They're doing it because they found a way they can make some cash on it. Again, it's not all about money. It's not like these guys are evil or something like that. But in order to make money where other people haven't, you have to figure out how to do things a little bit cheaper and kind of change your staffing model. And maybe you end up doing a bunch of transfers and sometimes leaving the area you're supposed to be covering uncovered. So again, there's good things and bad things, and in some places this works great, and in some places it works terrible. But every place is a little bit different. So the other thing people often say is that if you've seen one EMS service, you've seen one EMS service. They're all different, and there's lots of variations on each of these. There's other models that you can use. There's this thing called a public utility model that's not uncommon. So again, this is not exhaustive. This is just kind of touching on the services you might see and the stuff you may kind of come in contact in central and eastern Kentucky primarily. So urban and rural services are a little bit different, and we'll talk about those for just a second. Lexington is an urban system, essentially. What we've got in Lexington is a relatively high population density, lots of people hurting themselves and doing things to themselves and getting hurt, but there's also a high density of fire stations or EMS stations. And so response times are relatively small, and it's also relatively close to some big hospitals. So when you get picked up by Lexington Fire, you are probably, maybe 5 or 10 minutes from the hospital itself. So even if all they were able to do was provide transportation, you're pretty close to some big, well-prepared, well-funded hospitals, and you're probably going to do pretty well. When you get into the rural setting, things are quite a bit different. So rural services don't have near the run volume because the population density is not that high and there's just not that many people to hurt themselves, at least as frequently. Now, people still do, and again, everybody's got the right to good EMS care. So it's a little hard for these services to provide a lot of training or to be really close to a person because just geographically, you can maybe only afford to have 1 or 2 ambulances to cover an entire county. So that means that if you are out in the middle of Powell County and you call 911 because your dad collapses in front of you, it may be 15 to 20 minutes before an ambulance is even able to get there. And then once you actually get into that ambulance, it may be 45 minutes to any hospital, not like the big level 1 trauma centers or the tertiary care centers it may be 45 minutes to an hour to get to any hospital at all. So these providers are really having to take care of their patient in one of the most critical time periods of the patient's hospital course. And again, these guys are usually not as well funded as urban services, and they certainly don't get as much training, and they don't get as much practice because they're just not as busy with a lower population density. So even though these guys are the ones that really have to know how to take care of patients because they're the ones that are going to be doing it for a while, they're the ones that usually get the least resources to do so. And as a personal pitch, that's got to change. We're kind of working on it, but it's something that that right now is an inequity in pre-hospital care. So there's a list of stuff. We'll just kind of leave it at that. Let's talk about EMS providers real quick. These are the folks that are actually out there. In Kentucky, there's 4 levels of EMS provider, or at least certified or licensed EMS provider. The lowest level, or the most basically trained level, is the medical first responder. And this is maybe a police officer or a firefighter who's not a paramedic or an EMT, or this is maybe a third-year medical student who's taken the class and passed the certification. And these guys are trained in basic life-saving skills, so basic first aid, chest compression-only CPR, and use of an AED. They're folks that have a little bit of medical training and are able to get out there and start stuff while the rest of the emergency medical system is being activated. What separates these guys from, say, you, who as a third-year medical student have a ton more medical knowledge already, what separates the medical first responder from you is that if you are walking around outside and you see somebody get hit by a car or collapse, you're right now not under an obligation to do anything. There's no duty for you to respond and try to help this person. If you're a medical first responder, you have a duty to try to provide that medical care. So if a police officer shows up, and every place is a little bit different, just take this as kind of an example. If a police officer shows up and he is acting as a medical first responder as well, it's not okay for him to just say, I'm just a cop, my job is to stop traffic. If he needs to provide medical care, he is supposed to start providing medical care. So it's that duty to act that actually makes a medical first responder different than just another person or an untrained or uncertified person who responds to the scene of an incident. EMTB, or EMT Basic, or Basics, or EMTs as they're usually called, this is sort of the ground level for professional EMS providers in Kentucky. And again, an EMT has less medical knowledge than you do, but the thing that sort of makes an EMT different from you, at least as a healthcare provider, is of course a duty to act if they're in that capacity, but also the ability to legally provide medical care in the field. So these guys can carry oxygen. They can give some medicines. They're mostly there to help you take some of your medicines like nitroglycerin and that kind of stuff, but they give like EpiPens and that sort of thing for anaphylaxis. And these are also the first level of people that are licensed to transport a patient. So you can't go out with your car and say that I'm going to transport people to the hospital, at least not without incurring some legal trouble, potentially getting sued or creating a criminal act. So EMT Basic, or these guys are the ones that run BLS ambulances or BLS services, basic life support. If you see something that says BLS, that means it's staffed by EMTs. These guys can provide basic life-saving care, some medications, oxygen, and transport people. Advanced EMT is the next step up, and this is kind of almost a stopgap measure for services that can't afford to send people to paramedic school or need something more than just EMTs, but aren't able to get paramedics. So these guys have training on some specific skills like some airway management, some drug administration. They're able to do more stuff than an EMT, but not as much as a paramedic, and it's mostly skill-based. So there's not a big knowledge or critical thinking component that's stressed with a lot of advanced EMT programs. This is relatively kind of new in Kentucky, so there's not a lot of these guys out there. You probably won't see them often, if at all. And then paramedics or EMTPs or medics. These are the guys that when you see an ambulance that says ALS or Advanced Life Support, that means there's a paramedic on board. And after you get your EMT, this is about, we'll say, 18-month course. In some places it's less, in some places it's a little bit more. But about 18 months of training in order to become a paramedic. And these guys have a good fund of knowledge for not only emergencies, but also for the more mundane kind of things. And they have a pretty wide skill set, and they are likewise able to treat and transport people as well. So paramedics can do things like needle chest decompression. They can do airway management. In most cases, they can intubate, but they probably can't use drugs to intubate, at least in a lot of states. And Kentucky, they're allowed to give drugs after you've intubated somebody for a little bit of sedation, but not actually give drugs to facilitate sedation or paralytics to facilitate sedation unless they carry a special certification. They can do IV access, they can give lots of different medications, and they can do other procedures as well. Some can start blood, some are able to do chest tubes. Paramedics can do a lot of stuff, but they also carry with it what's supposed to be more of a critical thinking base or a knowledge base that allows them to make some clinical decisions instead of just following, I'm either doing CPR or I'm giving oxygen or I'm transporting. So they're able to actually think more and provide some better medical care, at least theoretically. Let's talk about your role as a physician in EMS. There's lots of roles for docs. Some of us actually go out and practice in the field and respond to calls. But for the most part, physicians today do the medical oversight part of EMS. And what does that mean? Well, when EMS started, the EMTs and paramedics were viewed as the doctor's hands going out into the field, into the community, and physically doing what the doctor would be doing. And so they were directly tied under your license, and what they did, you did. It's not really that way anymore. Now EMS providers are individually licensed practitioners, and they can kind of do their own thing, but they still require medical oversight because there's only one group of people that are licensed to practice medicine, and that's doctors. And so everything that EMTs or paramedics do is actually done under a doctor's orders, under a doctor's oversight. There's kind of two ways that's provided nowadays. Offline medical control constitutes probably 99.99% of what goes on in EMS. And this is where a doctor doesn't physically or personally intervene in the care of a specific patient. The way that we provide orders through offline medical control is by providing education and by writing protocols and standing orders, which the paramedics and the EMTs then go out and apply. So if you've got a chest pain protocol, then the paramedic can go out and say, okay, the guy's got chest pain. I'm referencing my chest pain protocol. It says within 10 minutes, I got to give him aspirin. I got to give 12 lead EKG. If it's not an ST elevation MI, then I can give him some nitroglycerin. If his blood pressure is greater than 120, if it's less than 120, I got to start an IV, and then I give him nitroglycerin. If it's less than 90, I got to give him IV fluid until it gets above 90, and then I can give him nitroglycerin. And then I got to transport him to a place that's able to take care of cardiac patients. And that's all done through protocols instead of having a doctor physically be on the phone and say, you should give nitro if blah, 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 blah. That's offline medical control. Online medical control is a small but important part of EMS nowadays, at least in a lot of places. In Kentucky, there is very little online medical control. In some cities, essentially every call gets an online medical control call. And different people argue different things about it. But online medical control is where the EMS provider goes out, assesses the patient, and then calls a doctor about that specific patient for orders. And again, most stuff nowadays is protocolized to where you don't really need that. But it's useful for helping to make decisions like, hey, should we take this person by ambulance to a nearby small hospital, or do we need to put him in a helicopter to take him to Lexington and bypass a small hospital, even though it may be, say, 45 minutes to get him to the big hospital and 15 minutes to get him to the small hospital. There's also stuff that you can't write protocols for. So here's one example of that.
You've seen my channel 7. Good morning, UC. This is ambulance number 30. I'm calling for permission for termination of resuscitative efforts. We have a 30-year-old male in the house weighing in excess of 600 pounds. He's in the bathtub. He has no clothes on. He's wedged in the tub. It was a witnessed arrest. He was having difficulty breathing on our arrival. We started with oxygen in the monitor, quickly a respiratory arrest right into a cardiac arrest. It's unknown how long he was having difficulty breathing prior to our arrival. His family woke up hearing him hollering and called us. We're in a situation where effective CPR is nearly impossible. I tried for an IV on multiple occasions. We have limited access to the patient. His downtime at this time is approximately 45 minutes. We've got asystolic on the monitor. He's been asystolic he had read idio initially, few minutes, and then he went to asystole shortly. We've been bagging him, although we're also in a position where getting his airway open, there's no way to access him for an ET. And we're in an extrication problem, and it's going to be prolonged before we can actually get him out anyway. I have my supervisor 455 on the scene. There's no medical history, no medications, and no allergies. The only real problem he has is his extraordinary size. I'm not sure I've got anything else for you. Just that.
Stand by. Let me grab the attending, please.
So if you're an EM resident, one of the things you'll have to do at some point is provide some medical control for an EMS service. But that's a good example. There's not a protocol for a 600-pound guy wedged in a bathtub who dies in front of you. But you also have pretty strict guidelines on things you can do. So paramedics, while they can call people dead in the field, they can pronounce death in the field, or at least not resuscitate somebody. There's pretty strict protocols that go along with that. And in order to break those protocols or to change those protocols, you have to get specific orders to do so. And to not do so is potentially something that will cause you to get at least hauled up in front of the Board of EMS or fined, or even worse. So everything in EMS has to get done by order, and that can either come ahead of time or it can come at the time that you're actually talking to the patient. So again, the difference between online and offline medical control. Offline medical control is writing protocols and standing orders and not specifically dealing with a specific patient. Online medical control is talking to providers at the time of care for a specific patient to get orders or advice. So that's a really good test question, and a test question is really easy to write. So that may come up at some point. So that said, that is the basics of EMS. And again, this is not exhaustive. People spend certainly fellowships and years figuring out how to do this stuff, and people spend their entire career figuring out how to do this. So don't think this is all there is to EMS. But it's the stuff that'll get you started on it, hopefully. So I hope you found this interesting. And again, if not, this is the only time you really have to hear about it. So hopefully you've learned a little something, and it's kind of helped prepare you for the workshop itself. Just a reminder that when you come, you should dress for going outside, because we are going to go outside. Unless there is lots and lots and lots of liquid falling out of the sky, we are going to go out and do things like you do in pre-hospital care, which is take things as they come and go out and get a little bit dirty. So dress for the weather, bring water or gloves or hats or whatever it is that you need with you, and meet in the charting area down in the emergency department where the doctors all kind of hang out, and try to be on time as best you can, because we got a lot of stuff to do, and hopefully you'll find it interesting and worthwhile. So if you need anything, just let me know. Email address is walter.lubbers, Lubbers, @uky.edu, or get a hold of Di, and we'll fix whatever needs you have. So thanks very much. Talk to you later.